Hi friends, host Eric here, talking to fitness people, and I want to stress that today I'm going to do everything in my power to pay attention to the chat here, and the reason is because I'm making this live stream on argumentation. If they're busy in here, I won't double live stream. If they're not, I will. So, I mean, looks like everybody's muted. That means I can talk. Okay, so this live stream channel 2, live stream main channel, is titled Why Why People Make Terrible Arguments. Okay, so for those in the room, if you have any sort of questions or comments, please voice them. I'm going to try to make this as interactive with the comments and stuff as possible. And if you are watching it via the live stream on your computadora or on your el telefono, and if you put something in the chat, I'll see it because I've got it right in front of me now. Alright, so argumentation. The reason I'm making this video in part is because of my experience yesterday with Bellfire 44. But I don't want to pick on her at all, and she's by no means the only person in the world to make bad argumentation. I mean, perhaps that manner of argumentation is dramatically bad, like difficult to understand how one would draw conclusions in that fashion. But so most people, I would say, are accustomed to drawing conclusions, affirming things, advocating things, negating things on fundamentally bad arguments. So I think what I'm also going to do here while I'm making this is to bring up a document that I want to go through a little bit, because it's nice to have some document to look at and see the things written down that I'm talking about. Helps people to process things better. I know it does help me to process things better like that for sure. Alright, so arguments. Okay, so sorry for the bit of slowness here. I should have prepped this up beforehand, but I didn't. I will get us running here on this shortly enough. I promise. Alright, there we go. Okay, so for those of you who are curious or not curious or whatever, but would like to, if you watch this video, you will learn something, okay? If you apply it, you'll feel like you understand things better, and you'll also win arguments like on the internet or something. Whether that matters to you, I don't know. But let's go over this here. Nothing makes me happy. Drugs sometimes make me temporarily happy. That's why I'm a user. I think you have more happiness than you or love. I use drugs all the time. I'm not a loser or a user. I am a autonomous being medicating myself as I see fit, which is the best thing you can possibly do. Okay, arguing for results. Pre-arguing. Why am I arguing? This is a question people need to ask themselves. What outcome do I want? Do I want to convince you, or do I want to win the argument? Do I want to negate what you're saying, or do I want to successfully affirm a position. Against whom am I arguing? Another important question. Why are they arguing? What am I arguing? Which claim or claims are in dispute? Narrow your topic to a single claim and start penning. What's our framework? Which impacts are significant and why? Most times when arguments go nowhere, it's because one or both parties is not successfully attending to framework. Which kind of claim is in dispute? Is it a descriptive claim? Is there a fact in dispute? Is it the description and interpretation? Is the claim guilty of a reification fallacy or other category error? Prescriptive. Who's being advised by whom to do what? Are there open-ended alternatives or a choice between options? Is there a normative component or is it a matter purely practical? Is it a normative claim? Claims about how things ought to be or about whether a given action proposed is morally obligatory, morally prohibited, or morally permissible are normative claims. Predictive. What is being extrapolated? Which mechanism is being extrapolated to predict an outcome? 2. System questions. Why should we assume the system operates as indicated without other factors? All right, so let's pause there before we go into weighing mechanisms. One thing that is critically important in understanding argumentation is to understand that there are different kinds of claims. That we always argue about statements. We don't ever really argue about questions or commands because questions and commands don't have truth values. People go back and forth a lot about what the meaning of the word truth is, or use the word truth all the time without any clear understanding of what it means. Truth is a status we assign to a statement, and we assign that status to the given statement depending on a lot of different questions, but I maintain that fundamentally there's a 3-pillar truth determination evaluation mechanism, which is number 1, if the words reference things of the physical world, do the meaning of the words match up with the actual data of the physical world? So that's one way of determining truth. The second is, are both parties using words to mean the same sort of thing? In other words, are you both using words as they're conventionally understood? Is there consensus about the meaning? And then the third element is one of deceptiveness. If an individual is intending to deceive, it might be the case that both the facts in the real world are consistent with the words, that the use of the words be interpreted as they normally are, but an intent to deceive may take advantage of some assumption on your end, knowing that you're going to draw a conclusion other than the one you ought to, and sort of evade truth-telling through that technicality. So that's why we debate about statements, because statements have truth values. In other words, if we're debating about something, if we're arguing about something, what we're really arguing about is statement X. You're saying statement X is true, I'm saying statement X is not true, or we ought not afford it the status of truth. That's different than saying it's false. Okay, so is that Steve? What a douchebag. Steve, stop being a douchebag, for Christ's sakes. Yeah, I know. Well, he's an ESFP. They do shit like that. They've got 6-slot FE, and 6-slot FE combined with SE makes for a really awful version of failed FE. And then the SE just means that it's like, if I can walk into something again, oh, I'm mad now, this ball got in my way, I'm going to kick it. It's like that shit, you know. Anyway, the point is, that's not the point. Making fun of Steve for his lameness is not the point of this video. The point of this video is argumentation. So Steve's doing some really stupid argumentation here, and that's a good way to begin this video, I guess. If I'm going to abuse Steve, I might as well do it with good argumentation. Somebody said you use drugs because you're weak, and Steve says drugs, vegan and exercise, responsible use of drugs, magic, start with diet. If you don't start at all, you're weak and nothing is more important than your laziness. Okay, that's, first of all, diet is not how you accomplish anything, okay? As I've explained before, your body extracts from the food that you eat the nutrition it needs. If there's extra, it stores it as fat, and it is important to get a minimum number of vitamins and minerals and stuff that you need. But anybody can do that by eating just about anything in the modern world. So, no, diet doesn't matter. It's unrelated to body weight and health, and it's a big, massive lie. We know it's unrelated, or largely unrelated. It's a tiny, tiny factor because I've lived with 2 consecutive women, both of whom were heavier than me. My last wife was rather a large woman, and she consistently ate less than me. Kim also consistently eats less than me, but weighs more than me. Now, she's not large like Candace was, but is larger than me nevertheless in terms of mass, if not in terms of height. So, obviously, we can know for a fact, no disputing it, that diet has almost nothing to do with body weight. For sure. We know that for sure. It's 99% genetics. In fact, if you diet a lot, you're less likely to lose weight because your body becomes accustomed to having to shift from varying degrees of calories. If you diet consistently, you'll stop losing weight soon enough as your body adjusts to needing fewer calories. It's moronic. Okay, so that's the reality about diet and argumentation. We're not here to argue about diet, though. And Steve, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. I thought you were the one who said, you were the one who said you use drugs because you're weak. That was the thing that pissed me off, actually. So you actually weren't the one who said that. I'm sorry as a consequence. I don't know who said that, but it wasn't you. If you use drugs, good job. If you don't use any drugs and you disapprove of drugs, fuck you. Now, let's move forward. So, I believe we were talking about the wonderful world of argumentation and the importance of asking pre-argumentation questions. It was you who said that. Oh, so you are a retard. I retract my apology. Okay, so, what was I saying? Right, pre-argumentation questions. If you don't know whether the claim you're arguing about is descriptive, prescriptive, or normative, you have no business having any kind of discussion about it. If the person you're arguing with, one of the first things you want to do is you want to nail them down on which claim you want to dispute. Okay, let me clarify. You just made this claim, correct? Okay. You justified it with this reason, right? Okay. If you don't do that, people will shift ground all the time. People go, all of a sudden you find yourself arguing about something that you weren't arguing about, and the only reason you can is because you're not paying attention to what matters. Ignore all you want, fall in love with your own ideas. That's the thing, Steve. I'm not in love with my own ideas. I'm in love with ideating well. I've changed my ideas all the time as new and better alternatives present themselves. That's called good thinking. Okay, so it's easier to argue about descriptive claims than it is about prescriptive or normative claims. Prescriptive claims are those that say we should do this for practical reasons. Or, like the doctor says, you should take this drug as a prescription for your illness because it'll make you better. That's for practical reasons. There's no moral component in it. It's not like you should give at least 10% of your yearly income to the poor. That's a normative claim because it's obviously not practically beneficial to you to do that. It's saying we have some sort of ethical obligation that indicates we ought to do it. If you're arguing about a predictive claim and somebody's saying we need to do X for prescriptive because reality Y will extrapolate into outcomes Z, and outcome Z is bad. So I might say we need to cut emissions, we need to curb emissions worldwide because global warming will continue to heat up the planet and kill us all, and that's bad. That would be a predictive claim. And a prescriptive claim in one. It may use additionally normative claims. The predictive claim is the warrant for the predicted outcome that justifies the prescriptive claim. In other words, I have a reason that says global warming is and is continuing on its current course. That, assuming it does continue on its current course, this will be the state of the world in X number of years. We want to prevent that, thus we should take action Y now. Of course, if you were making those sort of arguments that we should take action because the problem is so bad, you're making a bad argument. You're making a bad argument already. Inherency is what that's called. If you say the problem is so bad, the problem exists, we need to do something about it, all you're establishing is inherency. So what it means to say that you have inherency is that all parties agree that there is a problem in the status quo and some barrier prevents it from solving itself. For example, if I were to say, I have a solution to crime, let's everybody just be nice from now on. That lacks inherency because there's no barrier to that happening in the status quo except everyone choosing not to. And if I were to say, I know, let's pass a law to prevent little children from working in factories because it's bad when little children have to work in factories 40 hours a week, then that would have no inherency because such labor laws already exist and there's no problem of child labor in the United States generally in terms of like making little kids work in factories and stuff. So it lacks inherency. A lot of people, what they'll do is they're arguing for, say, a predictive claim or a prescriptive claim. They're saying, here's my prescriptive claim, we should do X, and all they're trying to do is to win the impact battle. So they'll say, we should do X, because if we don't do X, then Y will happen, and Y is so terrible. Why is so terrible? Because everyone will die from it being too hot, and the plants will all die, and oh, it's so terrible, global warming. Fine, but that doesn't establish any of your actual arguments. It doesn't establish that your action will actually make global warming better. It doesn't establish that global warming will extrapolate out as you anticipate it to. And my answer to global warming is always, we ought to do nothing until we determine the shape of the curve. If it's a linear curve, in other words, it's just a straight line going up at 45 degrees on the graph, well, then there's good cause to be concerned about our continuing pumping of carbon into the atmosphere. If it's a nonlinear curve, it may be one of those things where pumping additional carbon produces diminishing returns, such that it can only increase the temperature of the Earth so much before it stops doing anything at all. In which case, then the impact of every new carbon is less than the impact of carbon coming before it, and we ought to do nothing because the problem lacks inherency. It will solve itself. Okay, so far in this conversation we've covered inherency, and we've covered prescriptive, predictive, normative, and descriptive claims. Let me see if there's anything in the chat. LMAO. Is that ILMAO? ILMAO, are you watching this live stream? ILMAO is somebody I talked to a long time ago. I don't even remember how long ago it was. Okay, is that you, Spacey, saying that? Spacey's saying some awful things here. He's saying, I've never really enjoyed anything about life. I've had suicidal thoughts since I was 11. Well, Spacey, first of all, you ought to just eliminate having any suicidal thoughts by recognizing that it's morally impermissible to commit suicide, and thus there's no point in even having suicidal thoughts. Well, why don't you come hang out with me? Why don't you come to California and stay with us for a couple days? Why does that matter? Because look, really, whether life's fun or good or bad or whatever, here, Kim, there's your phone. whether life's good or bad or whatever, it's is it good or bad or whatever right now. You know, in NGPs, INTPs, ENTPs, we tend to want to link everything back to our objective representation of life. In other words, the narratives have to fit, or else we're going to get all upset about shit. Here's the deal. If you come hang out, stay with us for a couple days, and make some videos and have a good time, that's proof that you're wrong. That life can be kick-ass. Now, if you come out here and stay with us for a couple days, and I do my best to entertain you, and you still think everything's stupid and boring, then we can revisit the issue. So, when are you coming to stay with us? Spacey, when are you coming to stay with me in camp? Tomorrow? Tuesday? Are you going to drive or fly? Or take the train? You could take the train. Whose approach might not be the best? I can't live life for you, but I can help you if you're willing to be helped, if you have some strength in you. Steve-O, is that Steve-O saying that shit? Steve-O, you went on a life coach, okay? Neither am I. That's why I say, hey, Spacey, you should come hang out with me for a couple days. I don't have any advice to win for him. I just have goodwill and fun times to offer. That's meaningful in a way that who's going to respond well to this? I can't live life for you, but I can help you if you're willing to be helped. If there's some strength in you. If you don't go with my life coaching approach, you're weak. You're weak and unwilling to be helped. If you want to be helped, you'll obey me. I'm right, you're wrong, and I know best for your life. So, if you disagree, that's a sign of weakness and stupidity. You know, there's another approach to life coaching, Steve, that you might try. It's called the Dr. Lionel Sprinting Wolf Kazaquo approach. Spacey, if you'd like a session with Dr. Lionel Sprinting Wolf Kazaquo, he will teach you to sprint like the wolf instead of crawling like the cub. If you have the strength and the pure Native American blood runs strong in your veins, then you too can receive life coaching from Dr. Lionel Sprinting Wolf Caswell, authentic Native American, 132nd, and bringer of truth. I just don't like weakness. Steve-O, shut the fuck up. Don't like weakness. We're all weak in lots of different ways. Everybody's weak. We're all strong in certain ways and we're weak in certain ways. I'm weak in lots of ways. I don't like it in myself in the sense that it would be preferable if I were Alpha God. But the reality is, if you want others to meaningfully engage with you, that requires not only that you show them how cool and smart you are and stuff, but also that you be human and vulnerable and susceptible to failure. Thanks, Charles Benson. I like your Charles Bensoniness as well. I don't think you've ever been truly depressed. Don't be weak in ways that make you a prey animal. I mean, I feel that as well, Steve. But I will tell you that being susceptible to being preyed upon is not necessarily an indication of a weakness. In fact, Kim is very sort of down to fight her best fights a lot of times. It's not that she's weak. It's not that she's inherently prey. It's that she doesn't she's not good naturally at arguments, at argumentation. She accepts other people's framework, which brings us back to topic. All right, so I'm going to go back to here. Weighing mechanism and criterion. There are different ways that you can decide who wins an argument. You can compare worlds. That means, okay, well, you're advocating X, but your world after X is worse than the status quo world without X, so we should not do X. You could make a burdens argument. You failed to establish enough for me to agree with you. You could compare against a model. You're wrong because your approach violates rights, the model being like negative rights or something. You could do a truth testing approach. The resolution, the statement we're debating, is not subject to truth status. Or you could say, no, it's objectively false. The statement's objectively false. It's a metaphor and we can't affirm it. Something like that. Game theory just says it doesn't matter anything else. I said X, spot Y, that triggered this from happening, and all of these arguments collapsed. And I mean, I use game theory all the time in making arguments because it's the only way to argue well is to reduce them to mechanisms of a game. But some people will make the argument. These are called paradigms in debate. These things that I'm doing here. If I'm a judge, I'm a blank slate judge usually. But really, I'm kind of like a game theory judge. There's similar case and theory arguments that if you want to negate what somebody's saying, you don't have to address it directly at all. You could say, the problem's not with what you're saying, the problem is with how you're saying it. So, in other words, if somebody comes up to me and says, hey, I think you should buy this ice cream from this place. It's a really good deal right now, and I think you'll enjoy it. Then I might go, okay. I'm like, I don't really feel like ice cream. And then I say, well, you really should buy it, though, because you can get a whole gallon of ice cream for $1, and you'll want to eat it later, and that's a good reason to buy it now, and it's delicious ice cream. And I go, okay, well, that's a good argument. Now, if instead the person comes to me and says, hey, you should buy some of this ice cream. It's a good deal, you stupid fucking retard. Then I'm going to react very differently. I'm going to say, okay, well, I don't actually want to discuss the issue of whether or not I should buy the ice cream right now. I'd rather discuss the fact that you seem quite hostile towards me. Have I actually seen your videos, Charles Benson? I had no idea you made any videos. Did you tell me that already? I will check you out. I don't see, I never really click on people's names to see what they do, but I'm curious now. What's your channel called? Is it called Charles Benson? Is it called Charles Benson, Man About Town? That'd be a good name for your channel. Okay. Welcome, Blanky. Don't mind Steve. All right, so what was I saying? Right, oh yeah, back to that document. Weighing mechanisms. What? Where is it? Oh, it's down here, I see. All right, so those are possible ways. These are not really weighing mechanisms at all. Sometimes the weighing mechanism can be as simple as whoever best shows an overall benefit and impact should win, or something like that. But that's just one page document here. And I want to show you the other document that I made a while ago for some reason. I don't even remember why. Arguments. Common flaws in thinking. Arguing and logical thinking are different. That's a myth. Reality. Both are the same. Logical thinking is the parsing of claims for legitimacy. So too is arguing. The only difference is when arguing, more than one thinker gets to play. Winning an argument doesn't mean you're right. Myth. Reality. It's a failure to understand what right, correct, in this context means. Right is claim specific. If you claim that I owe you $10 and I reply that I paid you back yesterday and have it on video, then you have three choices. Number one, concede I'm right. Number two, explain why my response does not make me right. Or number three, not respond to what I said. In the second case, the argument is not over. In the first and third cases, I've won the argument. It makes me right about the status of the money the claimant says I owe, namely that I am no longer indebted because the debt has been repaid. Note that the rightness or wrongness is a status contingent upon the resolution of a disputed claim. Myth. Empirics are more important than reasoning. Reality. This flaw of thinking is mistaking the servant for the king. In all matters, empirics can do no more than substantiate claims. Empirics are the grunt work of thinking. Plate tectonics provides us a perfect case study. Prior to the 1960s, people thought that earthquakes occurred because the Earth was slowly expanding, creating ever more space between the continents. It's a sensible explanation. Then a clever fellow pointed out that the Earth is lifted and lowered in jagged fashion, inconsistent with the prevailing model. Of course, he had to go measure barnacles against sea level to provide the empirics to support the claim. But it was right before he did the empirics, and all the meaningful work was done intuitively, as is almost all the meaningful work of all good ideas. Okay, but not all, but almost all. Okay, as is almost all the meaningful work of almost all good ideas. Because we know what words mean, we can argue about them meaningfully. Myth. It is not sufficient to know what words mean to argue about their meaning. You must define them for the purposes of argumentation. Myth. Definitions are arbitrary and or the best definitions most right are from the dictionary. Reality. Nonsense. Definitions can be reduced from what they must and must not be given that which they necessarily include and necessarily exclude. Many definitions are mishmashes of poppycock, but it doesn't change the fact that words have consistent meaning. Bias is relevant. Myth. It is not relevant. The most biased person in the world, filled with infinite butthurt and a desperate desire to win and be smart and be right, still is entitled by any and all understanding of fairness to have his points heard and addressed on their merits. Okay, so those are ways to possibly mess up and Akabu 69. Oh, I don't care, man. I wouldn't have even thought about the name if you hadn't said that. Is that you playing the guitar, Charles Benson? That's a fast drummer. Is that Ragecore? Anyway, argumentation. Um, having talked about some of the flaws in it, let's talk about what to do to more successfully argue without knowing all these super fancy words and shit like that. I think that's a worthwhile thing to go over, but I want to do this other thing here first. Featured channels. Go edit layout. Walk my way, and 1,000 bad arguments begin to play. The thing about it is everybody thinks they can argue. Everybody thinks that arguing is just something that people do that doesn't have any real resolution, and that it's just sort of a casual, activity that all people engage in, and there's no way to be an expert at it or to, it's all just people's opinion or something. But it's definitely not just all people's opinion. It's relatively absolute. And that's a tricky one for people to get, is that if somebody is absolutely right or absolutely wrong within the context of the argument, and assuming the things that are assumed and yada, 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 then that's totally appropriate. We wouldn't want to live in a world in which argumentation were truly arbitrary and just someone's opinion, And it would be impossible for that to be the case because anytime you assign a status that's binary to something, as we do, if I say to you, do you agree that on Earth no animals currently exist that have the ability to shoot lasers out of their eyes? And you say, yes, I agree with you. Well, then that has to stay put for the rest of the argument. Now, it may or may not be true that no animals exist that have lasers coming out of their eyes, but we have to assign it a value to proceed forward in the argument. So, if you want to argue more successfully, understand that there's a flow to an argument, that there's a record of what happens in the argument, that every claim that the opponent makes or that you make is hypothetically written down. And then you can reference back. Okay, well, your first contention, your first block of arguments in favor of action X stated that the reason we should pass your bill for free school lunches is that X number of students each year don't eat lunch at least 50% of school days. You provided a statistic that describes the problem. Okay? So somebody's advocating for distributing money from the government to school lunches or something like that. In their first argument, they describe the problem. They say there's a too large a population of young people who aren't eating a midday meal. Then they, as subpoints of that, describe the problem further by saying this negatively impacts academic performance, this negatively impacts behavior of students in classrooms, this negatively impacts teacher retention because they get sick of dealing with all these hungry kids or something like that. And my plan will solve this problem. So if they're doing that and they're saying, okay, here's why we should do it. What things do they need to establish for you to actually be convinced that we should pass their plan, we should do their thing? Well, first of all, they need to establish inherency. Is there actually a problem in the status quo, and is there a barrier to it solving itself? The barrier to it solving itself would be poverty. In that case, kids are too poor to buy lunch or something like that. And the problem in the status quo has been established with his evidence about school lunches and stuff like that. So fine. In his first contention, then, your opponent has established inherency. The problem is, in most arguments, that opponent will use having established inherency as and present it as a reason to affirm his plan of action. It's not a reason to affirm his plan of action. It's a reason to believe his plan has inherency, which means, yes, there's a problem in the status quo. No, the problem will not solve itself in the status quo. Thus, it's reasonable for you to advocate we do something. That's as far as you get with talking about the problem. You don't get any further than that. You don't get any points. There's no reason to agree with you on what we ought to do, no matter how completely we agree with you as to the fact that the status quo is a problem. Because your proposed action may very well make the problem worse, even if every aspect of it is intended and designed to make the problem better. So one element in dealing with people who are advocating courses of action is to remember, as a negation, if you're trying to negate a recommended course of action, it's unintended consequences. People believe they can predict outcomes of policy, rules, things like that, and believe crazily that they can justify applications of force via their predicted outcomes. There's a couple of huge problems with this. Number one, it's never okay to justify the ends with the means. I mean, the means with the ends. You can't say, well, because this is a good outcome, it doesn't matter that the way we're accomplishing it is evil. It's never okay to justify the means with the ends. People do it all the time now, and you never even hear about people saying you ought not do that, but people do. And of course, the question of whether or not a given behavior, action, policy, rule is acceptable is independent of your intended outcomes. It doesn't matter how much I believe punching you in the face 50 times will help you get over your depression. If I do it, I've committed a crime against you. It doesn't believe how powerful a case I make that your depression is a problem in the status quo and that it won't fix itself. That does not justify your taking action. All right, I'm going to smoke this bowl.
You're being mean, Eric.
Yeah, I'm mean as fuck. I expect people to make sense. That's mean.
Good luck with that.
What a douchebag I am. Okay. Yeah, I know. I see what you were talking about there. Okay, so what was I talking about? I was saying something about, oh yeah, inherency not meaning anything in terms of impacts. Okay, so the next thing I will point out is if somebody's arguing purely on the backs of predicted impacts, then they should not win that argument. You should never let them win that argument. They need to, if they're trying to convince you, then it's obviously some sort of compulsion element to it. Nobody argues very long and hard over, if I say, I'm going to go get a sandwich, and you say, oh, don't get a sandwich, they're bad for you. I'm not going to argue very long and hard over it because you can make whatever arguments you want, but eventually I'm going to say, well, I'm hungry, I'm going to go get a sandwich, I don't give a fuck what you think about it, because it's me acting autonomously in my own interest for my own reasons. We get into arguments when people try to compel their ideation to become policy for everybody and force people to do shit that those individuals don't want to do. Now, it's perfectly reasonable for us to prohibit shit under threat of force, like if you stab somebody, then you will go to jail. That's perfectly reasonable because it's responsive to transgressive behavior. And it's not okay if you say, I'm going to stab you because you might do something bad, or I'm going to stab you because I don't like you, or some shit like that. It's important then for us to understand which justifications actually justify things and how much of a claim, how much ground somebody's claiming. If I'm advocating that I should go get a sandwich right now, I'm claiming very subjective ground only, and you're not going to win that fight. Because what I should do, I'm always going to win that fight if it's something like that, because it has nothing to do with you. And I'm not advocating anybody else do anything. But if I'm advocating that everybody should have to buy a sandwich every Wednesday and Friday because people aren't eating enough sandwiches, it's a whole different matter. Then I'm trying to seize a lot of ground that says my abstractions ought translate into physical compulsion upon my fellow humans because I'm attached to this idea or that idea. Now let's talk about Bellfire 44 a little bit more. If you're making argumentation like that, you're not really making arguments, okay? That's the first thing. If you're trying to argue about Bellfire 44, she came around here yesterday and told a wacky tale adventure that she presented as a set of arguments. But they were not arguments. No, it was here on the channel. They were not arguments. And, oh, you're talking to, my bad. They were just sort of stories. So her basic position is that the Jews came about because Satan slept with Eve, whereas white people came about because Satan slept with Abel, and black people were not God created, and stuff like that. It's a bunch of like weird narratives. So the problem, if you were responding to that sort of stuff, you hear that somebody comes and says a bunch of what is normally called anti-Semitic or racist stuff. Most people, I suspect, will react to it by condemning the person making the arguments. You're racist. You're anti-Semitic. But that's why those arguments persist, because they've got a good reason to then say, um, nobody's addressing what I'm saying. They're just attacking me because they're so politically correct and liberal and stuff. Now, she indicated that she's been watching my videos for a while. Yeah. And probably has deemed me conservative. Most people seem to think I'm a conservative. I don't consider myself a conservative at all. I mean, okay. I mean, I'm not a liberal either in the conventional sense. I'm closest to, if you have a label, a libertarian, but I'm what you might call a classic liberal, which is to say, I believe that the individual, via his or her own autonomy, is the only source of actual moral agency, and thus the only unit of being that matters when it comes to public policy. That my basic position is not that I know best what we ought to do, but that that guy doesn't know better than I do what I ought to do. Now, if I'm guilty of transgressions, then I'm guilty of crimes and I need to be punished and stuff. If you think you ought to do things like maim toddlers, well, then you ought to go to jail after you maim them, not before. Some people would try to argue, well, if you know someone's got a toddler maiming fetish, then we should arrest them in advance of it, because otherwise we're failing to prevent the harm. No, the harm's not guaranteed until it happens. This is a critical thing. You might say, well, we can't do that because these things, bad things will happen. Those harms are not established until they actually happen. It gets predicted. And people are, yeah, like domestic abuse. And people are terrible at predictions. Vector, what is this? Vector 3 POS, Vector 3 VERP, and POS new, Vector Unity Engine. I don't know what that stuff is.
It's
Okay.
Zach.
It's what? It's Zack Attack? Oh, is that Zack Attack? Not Stevo? I thought it was Stevo. Estevo. Anyway, I think it is Estevo. Who's Yayler's Fluorescent Light of Freedom? Oh, cool. I like that name. That's a smart variation. That's clever. Jen, are you brand new around here? You're the blankie, I take it? Um, welcome. Thank you for coming and visiting with us. And, you know, our rules around here are no expectations, no obligations, no stems, no fees, no stress. You don't gotta say hello, you don't gotta say goodbye, just come and go as you please, ghost as you feel like it, and nobody expects anything. Okay. No nudity, right. Keep your boobs and your vagina inside your clothes. Alright? My eyes start
That's
to
what room
bleed.
one's for.
When I see nudity, my eyes start to bleed. Jeremy, what did you say?
I said that's what room one's for.
Right. Room one, no bot. That's called the naked room. If you insist on getting naked, please go to room one. In room one, Yayler's Fluorescent Light of Freedom, not room two. All right, so we're talking argumentation, though, not nudity, unless you're arguing about nudity, in which case, I don't know. So, one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was religious arguments. I don't have a problem with people making arguments in favor of religion or God's existence or all that kind of stuff. But if you're going to make arguments about things not religious and use religious justifications for them, then in order for those to count for anything, you've got to get me to agree to some things. So you got to pin me down on, well, will you agree for the sake of this argument that blah? And I'll say, yeah, okay, I'll agree for the sake of the argument that blah. And then at the end of the argument, if it turns out that that concession right there was correct and it means that your point did withstand scrutiny, then I can always go back and say, okay, well, let's go back to that thing I conceded for the sake of argumentation and see if I really ought to have conceded it. But the point is, That's what you have to do. So if Velfire 44 wants me to take her seriously as an arguer, she's got to get me to agree to something that she can leverage into making biblical evidence legitimate in that argumentary forum. One mistake a lot of people will make is say, well, it's never legitimate to use the Bible. Well, sure it is. If that's the argumentational context, if that's the agreed upon object that you're working off of or something, I might totally agree to accept biblical arguments and still maintain a position that says the Bible's not any more spiritually true than any other written down explanation of truth, except insofar as some of its specifics might be superior to contrary specifics in other books, according to my perspective, or something like that, or according to this principled standard of justification. Oh, you should put a hacksaw in it. Oops. Um, yeah. Okay, deputies, time to pass out the mail. Remember, we don't look inside any suspiciously bulky items. What else am I talking about? Argumentation. Okay. One form of argumentation that's often not thought of as a form of argumentation because it's more like an interpersonal fighty thing is the hasty generalization. Kim's a big fan of the hasty generalization. If I accidentally step on the back of her foot one time, I will shortly thereafter begin hearing statements about how I'm always stepping on the back of her foot. So ISFJs take an experience and assume that that's how things are from now forward going forward, and then adjust when it turns out they're wrong. Saying you're always blah 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 is making an argument, is making a descriptive claim. I always respond to it in a couple of different ways. I'll say, number one, I'm not always doing that. Here's a couple counterexamples. Number two, assuming that I'm always doing something because I've done it once before is a poor way to construct a representative model of reality. So I'd advocate against it. And number three, you're just in a pissy mood because you're hungry. So I might do a motivational thing. I might do a factual thing. I might do a relevance thing. I'm going to offer a lot of different kind of rebuttals or something like that because it's kind of silly. Or I might just go, I'm sorry, sweetie, because with Kim, she gets a complete pass on everything in life, basically. Whatever it is that normally annoys me, I find it cute when she does it. Okay. So then understanding that to argue with somebody is to necessarily agree on a field. You can't play soccer if you're standing in the tree and your opponent's in the swimming pool. You have to agree on enough to define a field of operations upon which you can do contention level argumentation. Yes? Hello? Won't work. Okay. I'm going to mute you because of your loudness. There. If you were trying to make arguments to say Eve slept with Satan, there's no point in really arguing about that because Eve is a character referenced by the Bible and maybe other sources. Satan, a character referenced frequently in history, but understand that just because both those individuals are metaphysically existent through narrative, number one, it doesn't mean that a more accurate representation of interactive events between those individuals in history is meaningful at all, because the past happened as a set of individual experiential processes, not as a set of static objects that we can move around. Now, they get turned into that by a history or writing the Bible or whatever else, but they aren't actually that. And when we change the objects, so we say, okay, well, no, it didn't mean that, it means this, or no, that didn't happen, this happened. What we're really saying is, I want to use claims and evidence about history to justify the affirmation of certain narrative elements in the status quo, in the present. However, that never is meaningful because, like, let's say we all agree someday, one of the like historical controversies was William Shakespeare really the one who wrote those plays, or was it actually a nobleman who used William Shakespeare as a pen name? Well, it doesn't matter how many scholars agree with the latter, each of our realities is exactly the same as it was prior to that change of opinion, except now we have this additional string of narrative. That's the only difference. So, for example, even if you were to convince everybody that the narrative that Eve slept with Satan is preferable to the status quo narrative that Eve didn't, it wouldn't matter because the only thing that will have changed is that people now have an additional string of narrative. And to the extent that they decide you're right, that's a failure on their part because they're attaching to a specific descriptive claim about the past that's not falsifiable and not relevant to anything. So,
Didn't Lilith sleep with Satan?
Lilith, who's Lilith?
Lilith is supposed to be the one that was made before Eve.
Oh, Lilith was made before Eve? Was she hotter than Eve or what?
Supposedly in like Jewish texts, she was a lot like man, where she was like lustful.
Oh, it was like chicks unoppressed by male insecurity.
Yeah.
Lilith was made by God before Eve. And what God did was like, hey, let's have you be, autonomous like a dude, and let's make men deal with their own insecurities. That didn't work at all. Because Adam was like, what do you mean I have a small penis? And that was the end of that. So Eve came out, she was much more deferential. She understood her place. Out came Abel.
Yep.
Lilith actually, Bellfire said it was Satan having sex with Eve. It was actually Lilith and Eve having lesbian sex that led to the Jews. Okay? Now, it's true that Satan did have sex with Eve, but that didn't lead to the Jews. That led to the Eskimos. And we all know how horrible they are. Again, not a race, just mongrels, okay? Look, there's basically one race. It's called white people. And everybody who's not white is a mongrel. Like a mongrel. And we know this because God had sex with God to have white people, but the devil had sex with Jews to have black people. And black people have sex with Jews. That's how we get Asians. And when Asians have sex with white people, we get mystical creatures like unicorns and dragons. So I've made all those claims, and I've got a lot of biblical quotes to back them up. Well, you're going to have to back that shit up with empirics outside of your biblical frame of reference for it to be even remotely meaningful to anybody. It's just a bunch of make-believe nonsense. I can make up a bunch of nonsense too, if I want to. What I can't seem to do is to get myself to believe it. How you pull off that trick, I'm not sure. Anyway, let me see. Any comments, questions, thoughts, concerns, complaints, etc.? Cheese making instructions. I'm going to look at the old chatteroo here. The old chatteroo. I think it's still where it was with Charles Bronson's Fort Worth Ragecore Band. He's got an incredibly fast drummer. He must have a double kick pedal. It's like on the kick. You know what'd be cool with that band there, Charles Benson, if you're still watching? Do the same kind of music, but have the singer sing super sweet romantic melodic things. So it's the same song, but the singer goes, I love the springtime flowers. I love
Kind of like
the gaiety
Evanescence.
too. With gaiety here and gaiety there. Wonderful, wonderful times. See, that would be a nice contrast. It'd be a good juxtaposition. Anyway, We're not talking about that, though. We're talking about argumentation. Now, Charles Benson might say, that's a poor claim, Eric. We should not do that. You made a prescriptive claim. You said that we ought to do it for the non-moral reason of making music that's more consistent with your tastes, Eric. And I dispute your claim. I say we should not have a singer do that because, first of all, to do singing just like that, we'd have to have you as the singer, and I don't like you, Eric, and I don't want you as my singer, because if you were hanging out with me all the time, I'd have to fucking kill myself. That would be a good response to my claim. Um, yeah. I think I'm about done with this live stream. It's an hour. Bye, everybody. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese, and if you do, fall to your knees and pray for forgiveness right now, or Satan will come and fuck you in the ass, and you'll make some Mexicans.